desert, for I walk in this world. Good morning. Well, here we are again, talking about the resurrection. Yesterday we talked about the resurrection of Jesus and the evidence at hand that is so convincing that that event really did happen. Today we're going to go back and look at another set of facts that are also very convincing concerning the resurrection. Josh McDowell wrote a little book called The Resurrection Factor. I highly recommend the book. It's a little thin book, and yet it's just packed full of great evidences. It went out of print for a while. I think it's back in print now, but at any rate, you can buy copies of it on Amazon and probably on eBay and some other places. But McDowell listed a set of facts that he called circumstantial evidence that contribute to the credibility of the resurrection story. I want to share those facts, those circumstantial evidences with you today. First of all, there is the existence of the church. How else can the church be explained? Born 50 days after Passover, which would make it about 48 days after the resurrection, how can that possibly be explained? Because here is a body that is supposedly built on the reality of the resurrection, and yet how can that be if the resurrection didn't take place? On that initial surge, there were, on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 people that were baptized into Christ. 3,000 people added to this body that was the body of believers, the church. So, and by the way, 3,000 on that day, within a few days, 5,000. We see early in the book of Acts, the number of disciples were added to daily. The number of disciples multiplied. A great many of the priests were becoming obedient to the faith. There was this huge growing body of believers, and they were all based, this whole existence was based on the fact that Jesus had come and had been crucified and buried and resurrected. How can you explain the existence of the church without the resurrection? Some of those people in that surge were eyewitnesses to what had gone on in Jerusalem in those days. And all of these people in the early church were committing their lives to Christ. If in fact Christ was not resurrected from the dead, what were they committing their lives to? Some new religious teaching? It never would have lasted. The existence of the church is a powerful statement about the resurrection. The fact that Christians worship on Sunday is another evidence. All through Jewish history, starting with the law of Moses, the worship day for the Jews was on the seventh day of the week. Remember the Sabbath day, the commandment says, the seventh day of the week. And that was observed all the way through the Old Testament and even during the time of the Gospels. But from the time that the church was born on, the Christians met on the first day of the week, what we would call Sunday. It is, in the minds of the people, the resurrection day. And therefore the church meets on the first day of the week, according to Acts 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. Revelation 1:10 talks about the Lord's Day in a distinctive way. Christians met on the first day of the week. Why did they do that? Why did they change? If in fact the gospel and the story of Jesus was just an extension of what we read in the Old Testament, how is it that they changed? What justified that? Well, it was the resurrection. Another evidence is the act of baptism. In Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through about 11, it talks about the death that we are baptized into Christ and thus we are baptized into his death. We are buried with him in baptism, and therefore we are then resurrected to a newness of life. Without the resurrection, baptism becomes a dismal, sad event. It would observe only the death of Jesus. And yet it is so much more than that, according to Romans. The whole of the gospel has this starting point for the Christian life being the baptism of an individual, letting go of their old life, letting it, in effect, die, and to be buried in the water of baptism, and then resurrected to a newness of life. Baptism is a strong evidence for the reality of the resurrection. Another thing that the church does is communion, or what we might call the Lord's Supper. It was initiated by Jesus when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." It is a remembrance of his death. And in doing so, we are taking of this emblem of the body and the emblem of the blood. And yet that communion itself would be kind of a sad, dismal thing without the reality that carries us beyond that. The fact that Christians celebrate communion is not a celebration just of death. It is also a celebration of life, the new life that we have in Christ. And then the final, what McDowell calls circumstantial evidence, is the fact that following the resurrection of Jesus, there were these substantially changed lives. Now, I'm going to spend more time on this next week, on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, as we talk about the immediate reverberations of the resurrection. But let me just say here, those changed lives are a testimony in and of themselves that something far beyond anything that anybody had ever experienced had actually occurred. The lives of those apostles, remember those apostles who, upon the death of Jesus, started going back to their fishing nets, started seeping back into their lives before Christ. But following the resurrection, there was this newness of commitment to Christ and to all that he was about. The rest of the early Christians were showing this substantial commitment to something that really would have very little explanation if, in fact, the end of the story of Jesus was in the grave. But the fact that he was resurrected gave this calling to these early Christians that they were called to a newness of life as well, and they were called to a resurrection that they would someday experience. The fact that the gospel reached into the lives of Gentiles is an amazing fact. It had hitherto been purely a Jewish teaching based on the law of Moses leading up to Jesus. And yet Jesus said he didn't come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. And the fulfilling of that was that the message would also go to the rest of the world, to all the Gentiles as well. There were those that were former enemies of Jesus who were suddenly committed to him in a strong new way. What would have convinced them to be committed to him if, in fact, he had simply been laid in a tomb and forgotten there? The willingness of all of these early disciples to suffer for the cause of Christ is an amazing thing. People willing to go to their own death because they were convinced of resurrection. Indeed, the Gospels have given us a great account, things that we can be very grateful for, things that we still observe today that are a reflection of the power of resurrection. I hope that the rest of this day for you is a reflection of your own resurrected life. We are new creatures in life, in Christ every day. And so we live this resurrected life. It is the gift that he has given us. And we look forward to that day when we all have that final resurrection into eternity. What a promise. starting with Jesus, extending to all willing humanity. We follow Christ into his death, his burial, and his resurrection. Make it a great day. Bye.
They resound with God's own heart. Oh, let the ancient words impart. Words of life, words of hope.